Well, I like to welcome each of you tonight. Appreciate you joining in for our Ag in the Evening program. Vanessa's going to put some questions up on the board to make sure you can see the presentation and hear her. If you can answer those for us, it would certainly be helpful. Other than that, I'll just appreciate you being here tonight, and we've got a great subject. It seems like everything in the world's a little off kilter right now, but what I can assure you of is that when it comes time for things like the armyworms to come out, they don't have any care for coronavirus. They are certainly, I haven't had any yet, but I know they're coming. So I'll turn that over to Dr. Collier-Olson and let her get started.
All right. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you for participating in the poll. Like he said, my name is Vanessa Collier-Olson. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension in Overton. Many of you have probably already joined us at previous Ag in the Evening programs, and welcome once again. If you are new, Ag in the Evening has been a series since March, actually. We're hosting multiple programs virtually, and we have some coming up in June or in July. It's already July, in July and August, that we'll tell you about at the end. I do want to let you know that this program is being recorded. We do post these on a YouTube channel. We can share that. We'll share that link with you via email as we send out evaluations and whatnot down the road. So tonight's topic is we're going to focus on two forage insect pests, because especially at this time of year, they can both be problematic. I've already, in the past week, I've already had multiple reports of fall armyworms in various parts of Texas, of East Texas and Northeast Texas, and even in Houston County. And then this time of year is when we do tend to start to see Bermudagrass stem maggot damage. And I have seen some evidence of Bermudagrass stem maggot in some fields in East Texas. And we typically, for East Texas, we do tend to see those populations, or I start getting phone calls about damage kind of at the end of June, beginning of July. So that's where we are. So I wanted to talk about both of these insect pests and some recommendations in regards to scouting and controlling these pests so we can reduce their impact on our forages. So we're going to start with the fall armyworm, since that's the one that we are the most familiar with typically. Now, unfortunately, in some cases or in previous years, we've had very large populations of fall armyworms. And after that, anything that moves in our pastures or hay meadows, we tend to panic. And unfortunately, the fall armyworm is not the only larva that consumes vegetation. And so anytime we see a larva in our pastures or hay meadows, we worry, or we are often concerned, and that invokes that fear that we do already have the fall armyworm. So there are other armyworms that are pictured here. In the upper left-hand corner is the beet armyworm. It's in regards to color, as you can see, it's a light to dark green with, you can see those very dark stripes going down the side, and then you have a very distinct dark spot towards the head. You can also, you may not be able to see it in this picture, there is a similar white inverted Y on their head that can be is very similar to the fall armyworm. However, the beet armyworm is going to primarily be an insect pest in other crops outside of forages. So depending on proximity to maybe a vegetable garden or other crops in your area, you may see these potentially in a pasture or hay meadow. But as far as I'm aware, they are not damaging to our forages at the level that fall armyworms would be. The yellow striped armyworm in the lower left-hand corner is significantly darker with two yellow stripes going down its body. As far as I'm aware, it does not have a white inverted Y and is typically a pest of especially vegetable crops. So should not be a concern in our pastures and hay meadows, whether it's Bermudagrass or even our cool season forages. Now in the upper right-hand corner is the true armyworm. It looks probably the most similar to the fall armyworm. It does not have a white inverted Y, so that is a huge distinguishing characteristic between a true armyworm and a fall armyworm. So a true armyworm can be a pest in the spring on some of our forages, especially our small grains, wheat, oats, Small grain rye can also be a pest in corn. I did this year, for the first time in the 12 years that I've been in Texas, I did have some reports of true armyworms in some pastures and hay meadows. It's probably most likely feeding on some of our winter forages, but populations were not large enough or concerning enough to warrant any type of treatment. So just wanted you to be aware of other larvae. Anytime you find something in your pasture or hay meadow that you do have a question about, please feel free to reach out to your county extension agent. I'm an entomologist. I will try my best to help as well. And we can determine what it is and whether or not it's really something you need to be concerned about. So now we're actually going to talk about the fall armyworm, which can be significantly damaging to not only our warm season perennial forages in the kind of late summer fall period, as well as can be very damaging to our cool season forages such as annual ryegrass or our small grains that we tend to plant late September, early October. So here is a picture visualization of the fall armyworm. It's a very dark brown larva with very dark stripes going down both sides of the body. At the last segment has 4 very dark spots. And then of course the inverted Y is very significant and very distinct to the fall armyworm as far as identification. Now, when the larvae are smaller, they're often kind of very green or paler brown, but as they mature, they go through those larva stages, they do tend to get darker in color. So in regards to the moth is the adult, and we'll look at the life cycle here in a minute. So we have the male moth in the upper left-hand corner, and then the female moth in the lower right-hand corner. Their top portion of their wings are very dark. Obviously, you can tell in the male has some very dark patterns, very significant, much more distinct patterns as opposed to the female, and obviously a little bit larger moth. The lower portion of the wings are almost transparent with kind of that brown edging or stripe, kind of gets a little bit darker at the edge. So those are the moths. Now the moths are going to be like most moths, flying around lights in the evenings and what have you. The best way to identify or to know whether you have the fall armyworm is to actually scout for the larvae. Sometimes you can watch for birds that are congregating in portions of your pastures. They are typically going to be potentially identifying or determining if you have a fall armyworm population. But scouting and knowing how our weather impacts on those populations is going to be the most beneficial in determining if you have the fall armyworms and if you need to treat for those populations. But just to give you an idea of what the moths actually look like, I, as a forage specialist, I would have to send any moths off to an entomologist to confirm whether or not they are actual fall armyworm moths. So it's easier even for me. It's going to be easier for you to identify the larvae, much more so than trying to identify those moths. So the fall armyworm can be a pest of our warm season forages, Bermudagrass or even Besiege, as well as our cool season forages. Now, fall armyworms can be picky eaters in regards to they prefer higher quality, very lush forages. We will typically see populations sooner or larger populations in well irrigated fields, obviously well managed fields that have been fertilized on a more frequent basis. So for a lot of us, our hay meadows might be our first concern. One, we probably fertilize our hay meadows significantly more than our pastures. We probably see greater value in that hay meadow, and that loss of forage by armyworm infestation can have a big impact on our production, especially for our hay meadow. So we may see more value in that particular location. We do, even though they are called fall armyworms, we can have them earlier in the season. In Overton, I think the earliest they've potentially sprayed for armyworms has been even as early as May or June. I haven't, just this past week were the first reports or concerns or even pictures of larvae that I have seen for this year. And so that was just basically the beginning of July. So late July and early August on into the fall, and we can continue to have fall armyworm populations until we actually have a freeze or a freeze event. So that could be a fairly long period of time. That can be from July all the way to November. So they are multiple generations, so they're going to continue to repopulate within our area throughout that season, so they can continue to be our problem. So we need to be scouting and being prepared to treat our forages if we have value. Now, some weather patterns to really pay attention to is if we have been dry, like we had been in a good portion of June and on into late June, and most recently for us in the Rusk-Smith County area, past 2 days we finally had some rainfall, and we've been dry for a period of time, and other areas have gotten some rainfall at various times. But if we have been dry and then we receive some rainfall, that is a good opportunity for armyworms to become a problem, for them to start hatching and start actively feeding on our forages. So I always recommend, if you are in a location, and Jacob there in Tyler County is getting some rainfall this evening, and part of the southern part of East Texas is getting some rainfall right now, potentially. That since we've been dry in the morning, if it's even if it's still raining or maybe it stopped by then, scouting your fields would be a good idea to start looking for those potential populations. Like I said, they can have multiple generations, so we need to keep that in mind. That's been a common question. That's been a common question in regards to armyworms. I've had armyworms, I've already treated for them. Am I done? Are they not going to come back? Depending on populations in the area, more armyworms can move into your property. Depending on the pesticides you've used, could provide some residual control and reduce the impact of a population that moves in. Or if you're using a product that doesn't have residual, then they could easily come in and cause more damage or continue to cause damage potentially. There's a question, if you get lots of rain, does that help control armyworms? Unfortunately, it does not. Armyworms, fall armyworms especially, like cool temperatures and moisture. So moisture really helps to promote and support those populations, as opposed to something like grasshoppers. If you've heard us talk about grasshoppers, those spring rainfalls a lot of times can support a fungus that will control those populations. Unfortunately, that is not the same for fall armyworms. So if we have been dry and we receive rainfall, take that as a sign that you could have some armyworms on your property. So as we look at the life cycle, obviously the adult is a moth. The fall armyworm, the larvae nor the moths overwinter in East Texas. They do overwinter in South Texas down into Mexico. They move, depending on our spring and kind of early summer, they move up into Central and ultimately into East Texas. So a lot of times counties that are south of where Overton is located, which is Rusk County, a lot of times they'll get reports first, and then we'll start to notice populations as you move further north into the state. So depending on where you are located within the state kind of may vary your timeline in regards to when you could potentially start seeing armyworms. But once again, scouting is the best way to determine if you have fall armyworms. So their total life cycle is somewhere from 35 to 61 days. There's variation in that, and that is based on weather. So when we are warm in the summer, July, August, and the early fall period, their life cycle will be shorter. As we get cooler, before we have a frost, moving into October and November, that life cycle will kind of drag out. So it becomes longer for them, or it takes them longer to go through a complete life cycle as we have cooler temperatures. So the moth is an adult for 11 to 14 days. They lay eggs. They can lay huge masses, up to over 1,000 eggs in a mass. They typically lay those eggs on vegetation on the underside of a leaf. And they're usually in protected areas, maybe along woods or along fence lines, often close to where there's going to be a vegetation source for those larvae as they start to hatch. Those larvae will hatch in 2 to 4 days. And then they are in the larva stage, the actual feeding stage, for 14 to 28 days. Now, when they hatch, they are very small, And obviously as they molt, as they go through those larva stages, they will molt and they obviously get much larger. They can get up to 1.5 inches in length, so they can get fairly large. And the last about 3 to 4 days of their larva stage, they're going to consume 85% of their diet. So it's understandable that the larger the larva, the more forage they're consuming and the more damage they are doing. I'll also tell you it is much easier to control the smaller larvae. There are some excellent products that we'll talk about to help control those larvae when they are very small and to keep them from continuing to grow and cause damage. And then it will also take typically less pesticide. If you have larger larvae, you may need to increase the rate depending on a given product. Once they finish their larva stages, they will then pupate into the soil, and within 1 to 2 weeks, they will reemerge as an adult moth. And like I said, there are multiple generations within a season, so we can continue to have armyworms up until we have a frost event. So scouting is going to be the best way to determine if you have fall armyworms. Fall armyworms are principally night feeders. Like I said, they like cool and moist conditions. So they're typically not feeding in the high heat of the day, in the middle of the afternoon, in full sun. Now, I have seen them feeding at those times, but that's not necessarily very common. That might be attributed to large populations during that given period of time when I actually witnessed that. The best time to scout is going to be in the morning when we still have dew on the ground, or maybe right after a rainfall event, the ground is still moist. You can very easily walk through your field. I would recommend starting on the perimeter because those eggs are going to be laid most likely kind of on a perimeter, maybe, on a wooded, a forest edge or a woods edge of that particular field. I would start scouting on the perimeter and then moving into your pasture or into your hay meadow. And oftentimes you will pick those larvae up on your boots, maybe even on equipment. If you have a mule or riding through on a tractor, what have you, you'll very easily pick them up, especially when there's moisture. And at that time, they're probably feeding, so they're going to be higher up on the plant. During the day, when there's heat and dry conditions, they're oftentimes going to be buried under that thatch where maybe it's a little bit cooler and there's some shade, so they're going to be harder to find or to locate. For a lot of our products, those armyworms need to come into contact with that product to be effective. So another recommendation on treatment is to spray preferably in the morning. Once you scout it and determine that you need to treat for armyworms, go ahead and treat at that time, or you could potentially wait until that evening when they're feeding once again. That way, if you have majority of the armyworms are actively feeding on that plant, you're going to hit more of them with that pesticide as opposed to spraying in the middle of the day when most of those armyworms are potentially protected by thatch or kind of buried in that environment. So some things to think about, but scouting is going to be very important. If you really value your forage and we have good weather conditions to support armyworm populations, I would recommend scouting every other day to make sure you are staying on top of those populations. They can cause damage very quickly, destroy a field very quickly, and be devastating to your forage production system. So staying on top of that will be important to maintain a stand and have productivity. If you are looking for feeding damage, this is a good visual. When the larvae are very small, they are basically just chewing through the green material on the leaf almost, and leave kind of a window pane effect on that on those leaves as opposed to chewing all the way through. Now, as they get larger, the larva will actually chew all the way through the leaf. So you can look for damage, but once again, just walking through your fields and scouting to pick up those larvae on your boots or on your equipment is going to be much easier than trying to actually locate feeding damage. In regards to when we recommend treating for fall armyworms, the economic threshold has been determined to be 3 or more per square foot. And that is the level of which it is economical to treat, especially if you have value as you balance the value to the cost. of that particular forage. So it is important to consider the cost of treatment and to look at your treatment choices, make an economical as well as an effective, or a product that has residual control will help reduce the number of treatments and also increase economics and efficiency. And then also think about the value of your forage. Fall armyworms can be especially damaging if you have overseeded your Bermudagrass or your Bermudagrass pasture with a cool season forage, such as annual ryegrass or a small grain, and you are banking on that forage to supply grazing during the winter and the spring for your livestock. Obviously, that forage has a lot of value to you. You have purchased seed, you have gone through the process of planting, and you are planning to use that forage to maintain livestock during the winter. So there's great value in that. And they are going to be, it's going to take fewer armyworms to be more damaging on a seedling crop, such as some newly planted ryegrass or small grain, as opposed to a well-established stand. Now, however, if you start getting armyworms, in the next couple of weeks in your hay meadows, and you're still desiring to get, another or maybe even two cuttings out of that field, obviously that field has value to you as well. So you have to look at all of those factors and determine what's your best choice. But the economic threshold is 3 or more fall armyworms per square foot. So we are very lucky. We have a lot of options in regards to pesticides for controlling fall armyworms. Some of the probably older, more commonly used or historically used products would be the malathion or carbaryl. Carbaryl is 7. They do not have any residual control. They can be effective. Carbaryl does have some restrictions. We'll see that here shortly in the next slide. A lot of our other products would fall under the category or in the class of pesticides called pyrethroids. Pyrethroids, you will notice, I'm going to tell you that their active ingredients all end with THRIN. So zeta-cypermethrin, which is the active ingredient in Mustang Max, would fall into that class of pyrethroids. Pyrethroids would kind of be considered a general use insecticide. They will have activity on multiple species. Fall armyworms, true armyworms, they'll have activity on the Bermudagrass stem maggot flies. They'll also have activity on grasshoppers, oftentimes. So they will cover a multitude of pests. However, they do not have substantial residual, only about 2 to 3 days at max. So oftentimes you're looking at repeat applications depending on populations and movements of those populations within your areas. So some other products, carbaryl mentioned, there is a 14-day waiting period for carbaryl. Some other products, Dimilin 2L, there are generics of Dimilin 2L now. One of the generics is called Durant. The active ingredient is diflubenzuron. It is an insect growth regulator. You will notice that it must be applied before the larvae reach 1/2 inch or longer. So it is only going to be effective on very small larvae. Because it's an insect growth regulator, as those smaller larvae consume that diflubenzuron on that forage, that will ultimately keep them from continuing to grow and become larger larvae, and they will die. Now, it is not an instant kill, and that can be confusing for a lot of people. When we spray a pesticide, especially on insect pests, we expect if we spray that at least by the next day when you walk out, you're going to see dead larvae in your field. Well, unfortunately, diflubenzuron does not work that immediately. Those larvae, once they consume that insecticide, they have to go through a molt before they actually die. So it's not going to be an instant kill, but keep in mind those small larvae are doing very minimal damage compared to those 1 inch to 1.5 inch larvae that are consuming 85% of their total diet. One of the benefits to diflubenzuron is it does provide residual control as long as that forage is not harvested. Now, your cattle grazing is fine, but going in and taking a hay cutting, you're removing that product. So you're removing that insecticide that you've applied. So you've cut that residual considerably. So be mindful on the timing of the application with Dimilin or diflubenzuron. to make sure you're really capitalizing on that residual control. Now, unfortunately, all of your larvae at one time are not going to be very small. You may have some that are little, you may have some that are bigger. So a good recommendation is to combine diflubenzuron with a pyrethroid, so such as lambda-cyhalothrin or lambda-cyfluthrin, one of those other active ingredients. Combine them, and in combination, the diflubenzuron will take care of those smaller larvae and any larvae that might hatch within the next several weeks. So it'll provide that residual control. The pyrethroid will control any larger larvae that are outside of that ½ inch or shorter or smaller. We'll control those. So I think that's a great combination. And on evaluation on a cost per acre basis, it is one of our cheaper options for controlling fall armyworms and providing substantial residual control. Intrepid is another growth regulator, so it can provide some residual control as well. There are many other products. Here is a list of other pyrethroid products with different active ingredients, but you will notice all those active ingredients end with THRIN, lambda-cyhalothrin, which is the active ingredient in Grizzly Z. There's also a product called lambda-cy, is the trade name for the product, is also going to be a pyrethroid. Now, depending on oftentimes the active ingredient or the percentage of active ingredients, they may or may not have some restrictions on grazing or hay harvesting, so you will want to pay attention to that. Most of our insecticides will require a license, except for some of those products such as carbaryl or malathion. I do not think that malathion requires a license, but make sure you are aware of that as you go to purchase a product, that you have a license and whether or not that product requires a license to purchase and to use. So we have quite a few options in regards to control. Now, there are some newer products out there that you may have heard of. The active ingredient, chlorantraniliprole, I practiced saying that earlier and I'm still probably butchering it. It falls into Rynaxypyr. Some of the products that have this active ingredient include Prevathon, Coragen, as well as Besiege. Prevathon and Coragen, this is their only active ingredient. So I kind of class those together. This active ingredient has activity on fall armyworms. It also has activity on grasshoppers. It will be very important that you read the label. The rate for armyworm control versus grasshopper control is very different. So you will need to pay attention to that. The rate will be different based on the pest you are trying to control. Rynaxypyr causes muscle paralysis. The active ingredient is actually absorbed into the plant structure, so it has quite a bit of residual, 14 to 21 days, so 2 to 3 weeks, or potentially longer, depending on, as long as you are not harvesting that forage. Oftentimes that can help extend that residual control. Unfortunately, these products are going to be much more expensive on a cost per acre basis compared to diflubenzuron, but these are options as well for armyworm control. Another product, Besiege, it is actually a combination, has 2 active ingredients, the Rynaxypyr as well as lambda-cyhalothrin. So it does have a pyrethroid. The benefit to that for Besiege is it then will also control Bermudagrass stem maggot, whereas Prevathon and Coragen will not have any activity on the Bermudagrass stem maggot. So as you are looking at the potential forage pest on your property, make sure you are selecting a product or products in combination that will control multiple species. That will really reduce your cost on pesticide, as well as the number of times you have to traverse your field or make pesticide applications. So we have a question: what would you spray on emerging ryegrass since there is not much leaf? You can use a pyrethroid oftentimes, especially kind of at the beginning of the season following planting. If you have had or you're concerned about fall armyworms, the one thing to keep in mind with the pyrethroid is that you are going to have basically no residual control. So scouting those fields, it is possible that when you have a little bit more leaf, You could use a product such as the diflubenzuron along with the pyrethroid to provide some residual, as well as to take care of any larger larvae that have moved into the area. All right, so in summary on fall armyworms, remember scouting is going to be important. We tend to see kind of an increase, or they tend to kind of appear when we have been dry and then have some moisture or some rainfall. So this time of year right now, if you're in East Texas and you've had some rainfall the past couple of days, I would really recommend scouting your fields. If you irrigate your fields, scouting earlier and more frequently may be important. Do recommend scouting at least every other day. Most of us are already out in our fields. Maybe we're, putting out mineral for our livestock. We're checking fences. We're looking whether or not our herbicide was effective. So hopefully we're already out there quite a bit, paying attention to forage growth and our animals. So we can just add this to our list, go out early in the morning. You avoid the heat of the day. Hopefully it's a little bit nicer. Start at the perimeter. You can also use, if you notice a lot of birds in one pasture, maybe start there, scout that field in that area where those birds seem to be kind of congregating, spending a lot of time. They could possibly be feeding on some larvae, so that may help as an indicator. I would not rely on them solely as an indicator. They probably feed on a lot of different insects as well. But that can help maybe trigger and remind you to scout those fields. So 3 or more per square foot is what we consider to be the economic threshold. All right, an excellent question. When and where can you get a pesticide license? So the best place to start if you are interested in getting a pesticide license in Texas is to reach out to your county extension agent. Contact them. We can direct you on how to find your county extension agent, or we may be able to tell you who your county agent is. Reach out to them. They can give you the directions or the steps. There's some paperwork that you will need to complete with TDA, and then there are the study guides that you will purchase through Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Jacob can correct me if I'm wrong or not. I think they can take those trainings potentially for the license in the office, in the county extension office. Some county agents will offer as part of another meeting where yes.
Yes, ma'am. So we do a couple of different things there. Different county agents do. You can take the training either in the office, like in my office. I typically don't have enough at any one time to hold a big training, so I kind of do it by appointment. If somebody wants to come in the office to do it, you can also do the training online now.
Okay, good to know.
And then, of course, they have, and this is a change from years past, I know Vanessa's familiar with, but Extension no longer has testing authority over the pesticide licenses. You now have to go through TDA's convenient testing centers. So, but I think that was Miss Mott that made that comment. I can absolutely talk to you about how to get with the testing center and how to get started.
What's the closest testing center for you, Jacob?
So for us, and I'm not sure what all is open and closed right now, but for us, it has been Houston. Okay. And like I said, I'm not sure what all stations are open and closed right now, but that, and I'm certainly not saying it as a criticism, but that certainly when TDA made that change from allowing county agents to administer the test to go into their testing sites, I think they only have like 27 approved sites in the state, whereas previously we were testing at 250 county offices. So it is a little less convenient than it used to be. Right.
But there are multiple testing sites. I know there's one in Tyler, which is in Smith County. So there's a whole list, and they are typically going to be in a larger city location. but we can direct you to that list, and Jacob can help you, Ms. Mott, in getting all those details. All right, so for fall armyworms, scouting is going to be important. Thinking about the value of your crop as well as the cost, and especially pay attention to the cost per acre. And I will share with you a spreadsheet that can help you do that math very easily and quickly, so you can make a more economical decision on the product you choose. All right, so second, we're going to talk about the Bermudagrass stem maggot. This one will probably go faster because we are still learning, trying to collect more information about the Bermudagrass stem maggot. First and foremost, here's an excellent picture. I do not take credit for this. You can see the actual fly. One of my colleagues, Rocky Lemus at Mississippi State University, somehow captured this picture. And you can also see the dead leaves on that Bermudagrass plant. We'll take a kind of a look at a little bit further out, looking at the damage that is caused by the Bermudagrass stem maggot. Hopefully you can see here as you're looking into the stand of Bermudagrass, you see some what appear to be dead leaves. Bermudagrass stem maggot, the damage is going to be the loss or the death of the top 2 to 3 leaves of that plant. Oftentimes in the past, can be confused with other stressors, other factors. It's been, some people have thought they had a fertilizer burn, that maybe they sprayed nitrogen, they used liquid nitrogen, they thought they had a nitrogen fertilizer burn. Some people have been concerned that they had a herbicide burn. Other often confusing stresses, both bipolaris leaf spot can be misidentified as Bermudagrass stem maggot. The key to knowing that it's Bermudagrass stem maggot damage is that it is solely the top 2 to 3 leaves. Many of those other herbicide or fertilizer burn would be more than just the top 2 to 3 leaves. Diseases such as bipolaris leaf spot or rust are going to be damage on multiple leaves, not just the top leaves. And there's usually multiple spots, discoloration, not necessarily immediately death of those top 2 to 3 leaves. As you are looking out across a field, it may appear that you have like your Bermudagrass has suffered from a frost. And obviously in July in Texas, that's not going to be the case. You'll kind of have a bronzing effect across the entire field potentially, especially if you have a very dense infestation of the Bermudagrass stem maggot. So the Bermudagrass stem maggot is not native to the state of Texas or to the United States. It's actually native to South Asia, from Japan to Pakistan. Some of the first reports in the United States, in the continental United States, that I was aware of was in 2010 in Georgia. Some of the first reports, and I emphasize reports in Texas, were about 2012, 2013. I say emphasize reports because we could have had the Bermudagrass stem maggot before, but we just didn't catch it, we didn't notice it, or it was in such small infestation levels that we didn't notice that we had, some loss to some of that Bermudagrass. Now it is a pest solely of Bermudagrass and stargrasses. So our Bermudagrass species, such as coastal Bermudagrass, Tifton 85, any of our Bermudagrass even that is utilized in turf as well as in pasture hay production. So common Bermudagrass can be susceptible as well. Stargrass, Tifton 85 is actually a result of a cross between a Bermudagrass and a stargrass. We do not grow any straight stargrass species in Texas that I'm aware of. Some of those are more common in maybe in parts of Florida and in more tropical environments as opposed to in the United States. So here's a map showing, and this is probably could be updated. I know there has been Bermudagrass stem maggot in Oklahoma and in some other states outside of what is shown on this map. But you can see previously it had been a pest in California, also in Hawaii. As far as I'm aware, those cases or those issues were primarily in turf, not necessarily in forage production. Obviously, being a pest throughout the Southeast, it has become a major pest in forage production. Now, most of us are not going to see this pest in our yards if you have a Bermudagrass yard, because we are mowing so frequently. I think it's a big concern, or can be a concern, in turf sod production where they're growing actual Bermudagrass sod potentially. So this is the adult fly. The adult fly is very small, has a kind of an amber gold body, a darker abdomen, and its eyes are kind of have a reddish color. It may be hard, it's hard to see in this picture, but on that gold body, kind of towards the tail, there are going to be two dark spots, kind of black dots on that body. So this is the adult fly. Now you can see it with the naked eye. You can confirm identification using a microscope, but these flies fly very low and within the canopy of our forages, so they're not going to be up in our faces or maybe even our livestock faces. The only way to actually, identify a fly is to use a sweep net within a field and try to catch some flies and then identify them, or to use sticky cards that entomologists use for counting pests within field situations. So it's not something that you're going to come across just out and about in your field potentially. So the maggot is what actually causes the damage. The fly, as far as we know, or we're kind of assuming about what the fly feeds on, it feeds on the exudate or the sweat, kind of the sap given off by Bermudagrass, especially at night potentially. We assume that that's what the fly feeds on. It then lays its eggs on the Bermudagrass plant. When that maggot hatches, it burrows into the pseudostem of the Bermudagrass plant, and it eats the plant material within that stem at the first internode, so kind of the highest point on that stem, and that results in the death or the loss of those top 2 to 3 leaves. So the maggot is white with a black head, as you saw in that previous picture, about 1/8 of an inch long. So they're fairly small. We can, if we're very careful, we can locate the maggot within the stem, but most of us, once we see the damage, the maggot has already pupated into the soil. The total life cycle from adult fly all the way back to adult fly is about 3 or 4 weeks. So it's a very short life cycle, especially compared to some of our other insect pests. So that maggot is what causes the damage. So unfortunately, because that maggot is in the stem of the plant, it is well protected. So a lot of our, as far as we know, none of our insecticides are going to or have activity on that maggot because it's protected within that stem. So what we are doing with pesticide application is trying to control the adult fly. Here's another picture of the maggot. Here's a closer picture of that damage. You can see just the top 2 to 3 leaves are dead. If you see a similar damage, you can very easily pull those leaves out of that stem. You can see, because of it's basically dead, it's no longer attached to the rest of the plant. Removal is very easily. So that's an excellent indicator, primary indicator of having Bermudagrass stem maggot flies within your field. If you have had them in the past, you will have them again. So far, they survive our winters. Historically, we tend to see populations earlier in South Texas, Southeast Texas, and then a little bit later as we move up into Northeast Texas. However, they do overwinter. So far, our winters have not influenced those populations as of yet. So the University of Georgia, back to that map, Georgia, back 2010, they had infestations of Bermudagrass stem maggot and started to see the impact on forage production. So they have been instrumental in getting a lot of research done ahead of the rest of us, since they started to deal with this pest before most of the rest of us states in the southeastern part of the U.S. So they've actually been able to do some greenhouse work. They've also learned that the fly itself does not necessarily travel very far. The lifespan of the fly is up to about 20 days, and it does not travel very far in distance. Probably only about travels only about 10 feet at a time. So it stays fairly close to where it's come out of the soil following that pupa stage. They have determined, based on some greenhouse studies, that the Bermudagrass stem maggot fly does have variety or cultivar preferences. So on the left, you have a stargrass. On the right, you have a Bermudagrass, especially a fine-leafed Bermudagrass, such as common Bermudagrass or coastal Bermudagrass. And they found that the Bermudagrass stem maggot prefers those finer-leafed as well as denser canopies of many of our Bermudagrass cultivars. The stargrass on the left may remind or make many of you think of Tifton 85. Tifton 85 has a very a thicker stem, broader leaves, produces a more open canopy compared to something such as coastal Bermudagrass or even common Bermudagrass. So they have seen that they do have a preference, the flies have a preference for that denser canopy. I've actually done some research in Texas with Dr. Forrest Mitchell, an entomologist, as well as Dr. Alan Knutson, an entomologist with Texas A&M AgriLife Research and Extension. And in my experience within that project, I did have greater populations and more damage in the coastal Bermudagrass field compared to the Tifton 85 field. And they were exactly right beside each other. The only thing separating them was a barbed wire fence. So there was nothing to keep flies concentrated in one location. But I did repeatedly have more damage, caught more flies in the coastal Bermudagrass as opposed to the Tifton 85. So there definitely is a preference for those denser canopy varieties or cultivars compared to more open side that you would see with a stargrass or a Tifton 85. So there are perennial grass breeders at the University of Georgia that are evaluating other cultivars of Bermudagrass, developing potentially newer cultivars of Bermudagrass that would have some, I hate to say resistance, not total resistance. You'll still see damage and can still have Bermudagrass stem maggot flies in those more open canopies. However, it often results in less damage compared to those denser canopy cultivars. So they're continuing to look at some other ways, some integrated pest management ways that we can control this fly as well as this maggot. This is more of the research from the University of Georgia. So we have different Bermudagrass varieties, coastal, common, Russell, Alicia along the x-axis, so along the bottom of the slide. Coast Cross 2, Tifton 85, Stargrass, Tifton 68. These are all more open canopies. So if you look at the actual bars in this graph, those are the average number of infected tillers per pot. The line above, kind of the line within this graph, is the average percent of tillers damaged in a pot. So you can see that there was more damage in our finer stemmed, more dense canopy Bermudagrass varieties, cultivars, as opposed to the more open canopies such as the stargrass Tifton 85 there on the right hand side. So they definitely saw an impact on the population and the damage caused by the Bermudagrass stem maggot based on those cultivars. So our recommendations in regards to trying to reduce the impact of the Bermudagrass stem maggot, there are two recommendations. We typically will see more damage in our hay meadows because we're not harvesting. We're typically harvesting every 3 to 4 weeks, kind of depending on fertilization, rainfall, what have you. So we're more often going to see damage in a hay meadow because we're not harvesting on a regular or a weekly basis like we might in a yard. Whereas in a grazing, in a pasture, our animals are actually consuming that top portion of that plant. So they're almost controlling part of that population. Now, if you have more forage and you have a lower stocking rate and you have more forage than your cattle or your livestock are consuming, you could see damage in a pasture. And in years when we've had quite a bit of rainfall through the summer, that's when we've seen more damage in a pasture as opposed to other years.